but our allies, partners, and adversaries. In the game of climate change, there are no winners, at least not in the long term. In the short term, our vulnerabilities and reliance on fossil fuels are lending our adversaries a hand and further impacting the planet's ecosystem as they continue to drill for oil and gas. This project explores how we reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and what levels of insecurity or security that may introduce and how to mitigate them. It also raises the question of how to decarbonise manufacturing sectors that are critical to the UK's defence and ensure their longevity. Our reliance on technology, in particular, to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and increase our energy independence, introduces further levels of complexity to our security posture. Who are we sourcing the technology from? How have they built the technology? And do we have a stable and secure supply of that technology? Meanwhile, the UK and Europe's economy is being battered by increasing gas prices due to the acts of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Experts have called this cost of living crisis unprecedented, calling on the government to intervene more as increasingly people are choosing to eat or heat their homes. And this week we found out who our new Prime Minister is. Liz Truss is inheriting a serious crisis that will require short and long-term policy responses that we have started to hear about over the last few days and hours. The environmental, technological, and economic security issues she is inheriting will shape her tenure as Prime Minister and demand a distinctly interdisciplinary approach to understanding the risks and opportunities from the net zero transition. Our project on the UK's national security and the net zero transition will tackle these critical questions. It comprises an interdisciplinary team of researchers, including our new research fellow in energy security at RUSI, Daniel Marks, who's here with us today, as well as experts across RUSI in the international security studies, organised crime and policing, and cybersecurity teams. Today, we have invited two prominent and esteemed members of the project's advisory board to speak to you about the project's objectives and their analysis of the current crisis. Our first speaker is Chris Lambert, the director of the Westminster Energy Forum, a forum for expert practitioners in the energy sector to convene and share insights and information in the sector. He has many years of experience in energy security and risk through think tanks, UK government, and the private sector. Our second speaker is Luca Karate, the Innovation Network Director of the Net Zero Technology Centre, which develops and deploys technology for an affordable net zero energy industry. Luca has a long history in the energy sector from his experience in consulting, academia, and non-profit organisations. After both speakers have given their remarks, we will move to the question and answer session. I will do my absolute best to provide equal weighting to both questions in the room and online. So with that, I'd like to first ask our speaker, Chris, to join me in providing his remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Snaya. Good afternoon, everybody online and in the room. I think it's 17 years since I started the first energy security program at RUSI, which ran for a couple of years. And that led up to the first Ukraine gas crisis, 2009. So it's wonderful to be back, albeit under not auspicious circumstances. You're welcome to have a copy of the notes that I'm going to read out to you over the next 15 minutes or so. I think there's probably people from the security, the risk, the energy, investment communities, NGOs online, so a broad church, and rightly so, because I think everybody has skin in this game and a degree of concern about where the future heads. So what I thought I would do to help launch this project with RUSI was just to give you some thoughts from work that I've done over the years, which have led to sort of, I guess, a summary of what I would call energy and national security in an uncertain geopolitical and climate context. So what could possibly go wrong? So the first thing really relates to something you'll be familiar with, which is the hierarchy of need. and it plays into energy supply security. Now, you will have heard of the energy trilemma, in which a liberalized energy market is supposedly responding to a light touch policy framework to deliver that optimal balance of energy security, affordability, and decarbonisation. Well, this trilemma of a few years ago has really now morphed into what we understand the energy transition to be, which still focuses on security, affordability, and decarbonisation, but by 2050. So time is the fourth factor in this equation, and which makes it an order of magnitude harder to square this circle. But political descriptions of both the trilemma and the energy transition imply to us a clever balancing act that politicians, regulators, and markets can confidently model and deliver. But politicians are frequently reluctant to acknowledge the old fundamental truth that in times of stress, energy does not sit within a reassuring equilibrium, but quickly realigns into a hierarchy of need, and the scales then fall quickly from everyone's eyes. This hierarchy today is formed up as it always has been. Number one, access to energy. Number two, secure access to energy. Three, secure access at a price you can hopefully afford. Fourth, social equity. What price or supply limits will the public bear? What do you have to do to stay in office to keep the public on side? So that really summarises the position we are at in terms of the government's Commons presentation this morning. But the fifth one is environmental equity. And this is really the first thing to go, carbon targets and the deadlines for them. And, you know, net zero by 2050 was alluded to in the speech this morning, but really is a glancing blow. And I think the focus is very much political on supply security. And there's a concern about the integrity of the timelines for carbon targets as a result. So let's turn to what I call energy and the great game. And I'll start with a quote from the Ministry of Defence's 2010 guide entitled Thinking Strategically. The geostrategic environment in which we operate changes over time and as we interact with it. However, our knowledge of such a complex environment will always be piecemeal and imperfect, and thus the only elements that we can truly control are ourselves and the timing of our actions. So in an energy supply security competition, the only thing we can control are ourselves and the timing of our actions. In other words, don't rely on other people. And that's certainly been true since the advent of the global competition for energy resources. And it does imply a rather naive European approach to the politics of energy over the last 10 years. You'll know that on the eve of World War I, the then First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, made a historic decision to shift the power source of the Royal Navy from coal to oil. He intended to make the fleet faster than its German counterparts, but the switch meant that the Royal Navy could no longer rely on a global established network of British coal depots supplied from South Wales, but on now insecure oil supplies from what was then Persia. Energy security for the first time became a question of national, international strategy, and therefore of geopolitical and military competition and alliances. We're certainly back in that space. Churchill also determined that safety and certainty in oil, energy security, lay in variety and variety alone, or diversity of supply, as we would now call it. This remains true, assuming that there is enough availability in the market to go around and that the supply lines are resilient and flexible. Again, the hierarchy of need means that affordability is another matter still. And you'll have seen the bidding wars in the last few months over long-term gas contracts. During the 20th century, the Second World War and industrialization triggered ever greater demand for fossil fuels and necessitated further diversity of supply. This was exacerbated by the oil market shocks of the 70s, resulting in the additional exploitation of natural gas supplies for heating and power generation. However, as we know, unlike oil, gas supply has been hindered by the limitations of fixed pipeline networks joining the points of production with those of demand, until more recently, the technology of liquefaction has enabled LNG to emerge as an alternative means of delivery. Flexible tankered cargoes now borne across oceans to the highest bidder, often changing destination while en route, while the equivalent of gas gazumping occurs. The LNG tankerage is not really the issue. It's the capacity and build times of the LNG liquefaction and regas infrastructure that is required that represent the true bottleneck. Russia, of course, has known this for years. In the power sector, early proponents of nuclear power promised electricity that was too cheap to meter. Suddenly, by the end of the 1980s in the UK, the dirty old coal upon which Britain's industrial revolution had been built was redundant with the expansion of both gas-fired and nuclear power. Latterly, fortunately, low-carbon renewables, notably offshore wind and solar, have become both economic and deployed at scale, offering important sources of distributed power generation, diversity and security. Now, this rapid success of renewables most recently highlights the fact that, unlike Churchill, many politicians over the years have struggled to grasp. Electricity is not the same as energy. Electricity is simply the product of a largely inefficient process of converting energy into power. And not only do we therefore need significant energy resources for power generation, but we need an equivalent amount again for heating, and the same again for transport and petrochemicals. The scale and rate of the supply and decarbonisation challenge we face is unprecedented, and not least complicated by the fact that if you ask 10 different people what they understand by energy security, you will get 10 different answers. And this makes delivering a coherent, long-term, decarbonised supply strategy for energy both politically uncertain and very vulnerable. We'll see how that plays out over the next 2 years. And it's been true that within the UK, as in most countries, over time, energy has always been seen as a low salience issue politically. It's nothing to trouble us from day to day until the day it does. And then, of course, it really does. Before the current crisis, the last major bump in the road was the autumn of 2000, when the first new Labour government was still in its honeymoon period. And fuel price protests took place around the UK, blockading refineries and forcing panic buying. Now, this short 3-week period was the only time in that 5-year initial parliament of New Labour when the opposition was ahead in the opinion polls, revealing the limit of what the public would bear price-wise and leading to the abandonment of the government's annual fuel price escalator. So today we've had the new administration's proposal for emergency intervention in the market to reduce and stabilise prices, the impact of which will not be clear for some months once the winter is behind us. But I suspect that the limits of what the public and business can bear haven't been touched yet, and more intervention will be required, which may be a reason for the windfall tax actually being delayed rather than not done at all. We shall see. So fundamentally, in summary, on this section, energy becomes a national security issue when a government loses control over the integrity of its supplies, their diversity, or when the economic or social costs require a political intervention. Then well thought out strategies for a gradual decarbonisation of the economy can quickly risk losing traction or relevance to consumers as supply and price become paramount. And it's a real shame, actually, I think, that even before today, there was no real sense of end ways and means for getting to net zero communicated to the public in a secure context, nor was the government really aggressive enough on the demand side, because clearly the best energy is the energy that you never needed to use in the first place. We'll come back to that in questions, I'm sure. So moving on to the context of climate as well. The more economically advanced economies, including the UK, have been confident, perhaps even complacent, about their just-in-time liberalised energy market models. They've never really looked outward enough at the international great game of energy, geopolitics and trade that never went away. Most recently, we've also seen high-emission G20 nations backsliding, a quote from Alex Sharma, on their G20, COP26 carbon reduction commitments in favour of fossil-fuelled energy security adjustments. And this is at a time when climate deterioration appears to be accelerating and various environmental tipping points reached. So the scale of the challenge for the UK, which relates to the RUSI project then. Well, the Committee on Climate Change's recent report to Parliament was rather damning of the UK government progress in net zero thus far. To put it in perspective, the required annual construction rate for net zero infrastructure in the UK represents 20% of the entire power generation currently operating today, to be added every single year at a time of increased competition for labour and materials. In the UK alone, we will need to build new power infrastructure at a rate 3 times faster than we've ever built before if we're to hit our net zero targets by 2050. And it's a fact that no low carbon generating infrastructure that will be operational in 2050 in the UK has even been built yet. So that's the backdrop to the UK's emissions, and that is just the power sector. The Chief Scientific Advisor to BEIS, Paul Monks, spoke at a WEF session and put a schematic up on the nature of change required in the UK energy ecosystem, which, so bear in mind that the government's House of Commons report this morning. Paul Monks described the UK energy system as a complex, wicked problem. And to reach net zero in the UK, we need to help enable a global energy transition, enable a global economic transition, materially shift the nature of financial systems, materially shift the nature of consumer behavior, provide the means to not use energy that we don't need to, and then we need to modify the nature of both energy consumption and operations of the following sectors. This is according to the BEIS Chief Scientific Advisor: buildings, industry, commerce, agriculture, forestry, water management, transport, and the energy sector itself. So this is the biggest possible war footing, if you like, on an economic national security sense we've probably ever seen. And I think it's the carbon element which is the big thing, not the energy security. That's a personal perspective we'll come back to in a minute. We're way off track globally on the emissions reductions requirements to keep temperatures at pre-industrial levels. And there's little in the new nationally determined contributions to COP27 to suggest the handbrake turn required is going to be forthcoming. So we need to see energy security in that context. So in conclusion, there's 3 overarching issues I think we need to address in our future approach to energy security. The firstly relates to better coordination between key stakeholders. Put simply, the need for a fully integrated, secure and decarbonised energy economy will need an integrated community of people, a standing network of all the talents from inside and outside of government, the blueprint of which was the UK's presidency of COP. However, the COP teams are soon to disband at the end of this year's presidency, but it's a good model to build on. The second issue concerns the accuracy of our assessment of an appetite for risk. So the risk assessment capabilities within the UK private sector are of the highest order, but rarely do we harness and integrate this with public sector risk assessments. London is the centre for understanding all spectrums of risk, and I would encourage going forwards that the government seeks to integrate that expertise with its own. And the third and final issue relates to our ability to deploy low carbon technology at scale and pace. Now, I've outlined the scope of that problem and that challenge going ahead, which was there anyway before the Ukraine crisis. The suite of low carbon technologies that can enhance our supply security already exists. Data management to enable distributed energy, renewable technologies, nuclear at gigawatt scale and in small modular forms, carbon capture and storage, arguably, and the infrastructure and innovation for the hydrogen transition. The demand side efficiencies are a no-brainer, but are clearly not politically charismatic enough. But there is a long-term pressure growing for a tipping point in global markets. Heat waves and wildfires and floods and droughts are increasing year on year and are locked in. So the changes to the climate may be an order of magnitude worse in 5 years' time. So the current market upheaval may simply be the first blip of a major schism between the high and low carbon assets, in which the market begins to strand the higher carbon assets. We must hope that this is a relatively brief disruption in markets, and which follows is an accelerated move to a low carbon global energy economy. So with respect to the deployment of low carbon technologies across the economy, I'll make way for Luca, and he'll give you his expertise on that bit, and we can have a chat in a few minutes.
Thank you very much, Chris, and nice to be here, and welcome to the people online as well. Different from Chris, this is my first experience with RUSI, but I'm very happy and honored to be helpful if I can. You talk about technology, but I would like to make another reference to what you discussed. You know, that energy transition or net zero, if you want, is not just about target or carbon targets. It is about achieving that the elements in the hierarchy are needs that you describe. So it is about access to energy, as you said, it is about secure access to energy, secure access at an affordable price, social equity, and environmental equity. And I think similarly, I would say that national security is not just about critical infrastructure vulnerabilities or the army. It is also about stability and economic prosperity. And that links to that affordability and to that environmental element. So there's a strong link, I think. But what does that mean in terms of the technology for net zero and in terms of technology innovation? These are the two angles that I'd like to develop a little bit more. And how can we make the system of national security and energy transition an anti-fragile system, to use the Nassim caliber words? So how can we make sure that the resilience is in the system, both from both angles, from energy security angle, but also from national security and net zero energy transition? And I think the key question when you look at the energy transition that is going on and that will go on is who are the winners or losers on a geopolitical scale? Or is that a draw possible? And I'll come back to that. But let's look at the technology. So what technology do we need for the energy transition? I'd like to quickly go through the transformation that we are about to see, or hopefully we are about to see in various sectors. So if we start from the industrial sector, which is responsible for a small but significant and important part of the emission in the UK. We're looking at deploying hydrogen. We're looking at deploying carbon capture and storage, looking at sustainable fuels or fuel switching. The UK is targeting 10 gigawatt of hydrogen by 2030, and at least 5 gigawatt of green, which means that a 5 is from blue hydrogen with carbon capture associated. If you look at heating, now that we are about to get into winter and what a winter is to be, we're looking at heat pump, so electrification, but we're also looking at hydrogen when electrification is possible. There might be even some blending of hydrogen and natural gas in the short term. There's a target by 5.5 million heat pump by 2030 that the Committee on Climate Change set up in the roadmap. In the balance roadmap, sorry, the balance pathway. And if you look at power, you mentioned power, renewable wind more than sun in the UK, maybe for obvious reason, but maybe not. It just seems to be a more bias towards wind than sun. But also nuclear, resurgence of nuclear. There's a lot of talking about SMR, a lot of research going on to fusion, which is probably a few years away. It has been for some time, but maybe this time is less. And there again, we're targeting 50 gigawatt of wind by 2030, including 5 of floating wind. And we're targeting also 25% of electricity demand coming from nuclear by 2050. And then we can look at the ground transport. And of course, ground transport is electric vehicles, but fuel cell vehicle as well can play a part, especially in return to base fleet or in heavy good vehicles or buses and train. Aberdeen, where I come from, not for the accent as you can guess, but where I live, has a fleet of about more than 20 hydrogen buses, plus a number of others electric buses. So that's also changing. And then we have air transport, particularly difficult to decarbonize, and that is looking at sustainable aviation fuels, looking at hydrogen. It's also looking at direct air capture and therefore creating synthetic fuels that don't add to the emission at least. And then the big thing of shipping, which is unclear where it sits from a national level, because it is, of course, emitting most at sea in international waters. But that as well is going towards ammonia or biomethanol, again, hydrogen battery for potentially hoppers between the small island. So there's a lot to change. Let's not forget also the technology solutions to reduce the demand of energy, which is simply important, both from domestic industry, but energy efficiency, in addition to reducing demand. How do we make the most of that energy? So all sectors from a demand side, we go through a massive overhaul to get to net zero, or have to go through a massive overhaul to get to net zero. And interestingly also what one sector does as implication for the other ones. There's less of the usual silo that we have been used to, where oil and gas is one thing, renewable is another one, industrial is just a client. the interconnection and potential synergies between all the sectors is much more relevant. It's becoming much more important. So carbon capture can be used to sequester emission from industry, but then that infrastructure can also be used for blue hydrogen production. Blue hydrogen, once in there, can also be a bridge to more hydrogen in the system and pave the way for green hydrogen, which is another synergy. Green hydrogen is competing with the electricity demand if it is from renewables. But then there is an element of the infrastructure, the grid, how much can it accommodate, and therefore there's a potential for another synergy, which is curtail energy or curtail electricity going to green hydrogen. So it is a much more interconnected and complicated system than the one we used to, but it's also much more sustainable and a zero element. But what does that mean from a national security perspective? What we need to be watching? What are elements? What are the vulnerabilities? And how do geopolitics even play into it? So if you start from the supply chain, for example, so wind, offshore wind in the UK is a success story. Yeah? So until recently, we were the biggest producer of offshore wind. Now, of course, it's China, but we're still a big one. So is that a success story from a supply chain perspective? We basically imported everything. So wind farms, wind blades. So we did a lot of work. We are doing a lot of work now. That is changing. But if you look at what has been installed so far, a lot from a national security has been imported. I take the Kincardine offshore floating wind farm, which is the largest in the world for floating offshore wind. It is off the Aberdeen coast. So Grupo Cobra is based in Madrid, and it was responsible for the engineering, the design, the supply, the construction, and the commissioning. And considering how strong the UK industry is in engineering, in oil and gas, not in wind yet. So that's interesting. So that was the engineering. Then the turbine supply contract was awarded to Vestas, which is Danish. And the floating foundation was provided by Principal Power, an American company, and they were fabricated in Spain. And then the turbines were mounted to foundation in Rotterdam, and they were towed to Aberdeen. So from a supply perspective there, what I was talking about before in terms of social prosperity and stability, maybe that's an interesting consideration. And if you look at solar, which is also another key element of the energy transition, at the moment, China share in all the manufacturing stages of solar panel exceeds 80%. So it is a Chinese game, solar panels. And also the production of many of the minerals that are used in photovoltaics is highly concentrated, and China, again, is playing a dominant role. And the International Energy Agency estimated that the photovoltaic industry demand for critical materials would have to expand 150 to 400% by 2030 from last year level to attain the net zero trajectory. So there's a lot of dependencies of critical materials, so there's a lot of dependencies on technology, and there's a lot of dependencies of technology solutions that are outside the control of national control. And then we can go into batteries and lithium and where does it come from, but probably don't have too much time for that. But that was also one supply. But let's focus on another element which is interesting in the transition, which is ownership. So in oil and gas, the asset is a reservoir. That's where the hydrocarbon is. The country owns it and gives a license to develop it. In renewables, let's take wind. Is wind the asset, or is it technology to produce electricity from wind the asset? Clearly, there are places that are more suited. And I come again from Scotland. That's a place full of wind, and that's where a lot of the wind from the UK will come from. But who owns the asset here? I mentioned before an example, but when we look at example from other industries, take the aviation industry. We know that Rolls-Royce, GE, they charge the airlines by hour of using their engine. They don't sell the engine. It's potentially going in the same direction from an energy perspective. And what does it mean from a national security? We have a big wind farm producing a lot of electricity and power, which is needed by the country. And who has really the control over the production, the functioning, but also the supply, as I mentioned before. So there are new questions probably that coming from the energy transition, which are relevant for from a national security perspective. And that's about technology, but I would like to add an element to technology, which is innovation. And I think we need to look at innovation, because the net zero technology is available. We hear often, we have the technology, which is true. We do have the technology for the transition. I often make a comparison to the car manufacturing in the 50s. So we do have the technologies, but it is a very early stages of development with a lot of room of improvement, a lot of opportunity to become more efficient, to become better. Yeah, we could go anywhere with a car manufactured in the 50s, a Cadillac or those kind of car, but if you compare that to Tesla, and if you compare that with self-driving, self-parking, security level, energy efficiency, maintenance level, it's almost a different world. So we do have the technology, but a lot will be innovated, like it or not. So we need to innovate, but if we don't, someone else does. And so the question is, where does innovation happens? And who are going to be the winners and losers? Who investing more in IP now? So again, data from the IEA, from the World Energy Investment 2022, guess what? China is the largest source of public energy R&D spend in 2021. It's closely followed by Europe and North America. But also China's largest R&D spending growth, and are estimated to substantially outspend the European Union and United States by 2025. And if I take just an example, if you're looking at hydrogen and electrolyzer technology, which is very, very current because of the potential role hydrogen has in decarbonizing the UK and beyond. If you look at the patents, so China is leading by 5,383 patents families since 2005. So for context, Japan is second with 1,200, and the UK only having 139 compared to 5,383. In Italy, only 3% of the China patents are international. Most of them are only for the domestic market. Still, it gives us enough. And international filing as well is led by Japan, and then USA and Germany are making 52% of that. And I just say that because from a national security risk, I think the questions I like is, with innovation happening at such a pace, what if a disruptive technology from other countries become predominant and the control is out of the country? Will dependency of foreign technology and foreign IP slow down the implementation of the energy transition on security ground? Or will increase security risk? Is there a trade-off there? Did the Huawei ban slow down 5G rollout in the UK? And I think it did. But I think there's a substantial difference between the criticality of better and faster and more reliable communication with the urgency and the emergency of climate that we are facing. So, can we afford to slow down on national security ground? I'll come back to that. So that's why I say in the beginning, winners and losers, could there be a draw? And is the only way. So in the end, there is one planet, one atmosphere. It doesn't really know the boundaries and the carbon budget, which is how much we can still produce before the effect becomes irreversible, which some of them already are, is one. So maybe there are win-win opportunity. And you mentioned COP26. So a win-win is difficult because look, COP26, the negotiation, the final rush to get China and India to agree on the wording on coal. And win-win is fragile. I mentioned fragility, anti-fragile at the beginning, but win-win is fragile. We just have to look at China just pulling out of the collaboration with the United States after the increased tension on Taiwan recently. Still, you might say I'm a dreamer, but still it's probably the only shot is this collaboration. So I'm kind of looking forward to COP27 and COP28 and progressing on that front. But as I say, it's difficult and it's fragile. But what does that mean from a national security perspective? That collaboration with the competition element, with the national risk, how do we find the squaring of the circle there? And I'd like to make a couple of other considerations on the energy system that is changing, because when we designed and we commissioned the oil and gas assets, we didn't really think about decommissioning them or planning for decommissioning them. And so it's going to cost a lot. It's going to cost a lot, and some structure will have to be left in situ because they were never been designed to be removed from the sea. When we designed nuclear, we didn't really think about the commissioning then, right? So just an example, Sellafield decommissioning will take about 100 years and will cost 120 plus billions, the latest time I checked. And luckily, when we design and commission offshore wind, we learned the lesson, did we? Well, there's a lot of wind blades that are coming to end now after 20 years of use, and they're all going to landfill because they're very, very hard to recycle. So I hope that for minerals, for EV batteries, for all these new technologies, and for all the future solar panel, which is also very difficult to recycle and reuse, and the new offshore wind and floating wind that we are about to build. And also, if there will be more oil and gas assets or more nuclear, as we heard today, I hope we take more in consideration the circular economy or the reusability and recyclability. And I wonder if that also might have an angle on national security. But then to conclude, I'd like to conclude as well with three open questions. I made a few already, but three more if you want. Of three uncertainties that I think we need to address. One is what control do we have on the technologies for the energy transition? Where are they manufactured? Where are they serviced from? Where are they innovated? Is there a risk of foreign dependency? And the second is low and zero carbon technology. Is it going to redefine the global geopolitics as it's already done it? And the balance of power. And so in which way in the mid and the long term? And finally, do we have the necessary focus on innovation? Again, back to the analogy of the car of the 50. Do we have the necessary focus on innovation to develop the capabilities for the transition and also fill the gap from the oil and gas industry in jobs, in supply chain, and achieve what needs to be a just transition? That was part of the Paris Agreement goal. And I think the more fundamental question I have is, how do we combine national security with a fast-paced and affordable energy transition? And how do I avoid the trap of antagonism of this versus that? We make an and type of solution. So that's the question I'd like to leave you with and maybe bring into the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Luca. Those were some really interesting, I think, state of plays around energy security in the markets at the moment. And now we have a bit of time for Q&A. There's going to be a microphone going around the room. So anyone in the room who wants to ask a question, do raise your hand and do pose it to the speakers. And I also have my trusty iPad here for the people online who are putting in questions, which I am seeing at the moment. But I do encourage anyone online who's curious about any of the remarks made to put in their questions as well. But before I open to the floor, I just had one question for the both of you. I don't want to take up too much time because I'm sure a lot of people have some really interesting questions at the moment. And I thought both of you said some really interesting things around the pace of change that's happening at the moment, but also the pace of supply that needs to keep up with that pace of change. And particularly Chinese dominance in technology. And I'm obviously a cybersecurity and technology researcher, so I'm very interested in the technology component of this whole issue. But how far, you mentioned this circular economy, how far can energy efficiency and resource efficiency, like reusability or recycling, take us in reducing the dominance of Chinese supply in UK supply chains in net zero technologies, all the way from PVs through to electric cars and lithium-ion batteries. And I'll go to Chris first. If you have any thoughts on that circular economy issue and reducing the the dominance of Chinese supply?
I think one thing is the timeframes. And if you subscribe to a certain point of view that China has a 100-year plan about where the world is going to be in 2100, and it wants largely global dominance of the green transition for obvious reasons, then that's a powerful incentive for everybody to sort of use less, recycle more, develop indigenous technologies. And you see, I suppose, sort of exploration of critical mineral resources and this new UK critical mineral strategy. It comes down to dependence on a particular technology and whether you can replace not so much the technology, but recycle those critical minerals within it. I don't know what that is specifically for particular technologies, but again, I think there's going to be, unfortunately, in some cases, it's easier to exploit new minerals, particularly in areas where the climate is warming. You think Greenland, you think of subsea. So it comes out of price ultimately. I think, you know, things are as economic as the necessity demands. So I think we're in a bit of a false war on critical minerals at the moment. I think in sort of 10 years, when our dependence on them rises, I think that's when the market will start to innovate the recycling and the waste streams more than it currently is. But again, that depends how easy it is to recover them.
And Luca?
I don't think there's a shortage of those minerals. You know, the block at the moment is at the pace in which you can extract for the demand. But that doesn't stop, I think, the moral obligation of trying to reuse the materials as opposed to just extract, and especially because of the highly pollutants, especially when you look at all the materials for solar panels and other materials on the environment, because there's a chain reaction there on ocean acidification, which reduces the ability of the ocean to absorb CO2, which reduces the carbon budget again. So that there's a system element there. But it's more of, I think my challenge is more from a national strategy. You know, we're a nation of engineers and ingenuity. And it's all about how you design it. You know, do we design to recycle? Do we design to disassemble and reassemble, as opposed to build and then forget about it? At some point, will have to be destroyed, which is somehow history of the energy in the past. Yeah. And so, can that then become an industry and a business in itself? Because a lot of the materials in battery, EV battery, for example, can be recycled. You know, it's expensive. It's probably cheaper to keep mining them, but then it becomes a matter of policy and also security. You know, the more we have, the more EV battery we have, the more at some point the battery we can recycle for the same use or for different use. Domestic energy conservation or other stuff. Yeah,
it's interesting you brought up the issue of expense in the circular economy issue, because who then pays for that, right? And where does that cost get offset in the supply chain generally? If you're using a circular economy model, does that mean, you know, for example, electric vehicle prices will skyrocket as a result of the expensive circular economy that you're using for the batteries? And I think that expense issue also has an impact on energy security, as we heard from both of you, around affordability of the transition, and that becoming increasingly the kind of pinch point of the whole transition itself. And I think that's a really interesting perspective. I mean, are there any questions in the room before I go online? I've got some questions through, please. And there's a microphone.
Thanks. First of all, really great projects, really interesting. Thanks for the two interventions. My name is Tom Wheeler. I'm the head of risk response and research in the conflict directorate in the Foreign Office. And Chris, you mentioned risk, and I was wondering what sort of thinking, maybe it's within this project or there's others thinking about this, but thinking about how the energy transition might have implications for political stability or political instability in countries, perhaps slightly more fragile countries around the world. So in particular, for example, what are the implications for petrostates, for countries where stability is very much linked up to the political economy of oil production, or also countries where there might be demand for new natural resources, where, you mentioned, I think, a 50 to 400% demand for important minerals, where we know, there's evidence that big boons can be destabilizing in some places. So any thoughts or reflections on that would be helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of not seeing things in silos. I think I think your sort of conflicts and stabilization, sort of new iteration from what you said. So I think if you put a layer across all of the factors which can destabilize a region, climate is the big one, right? That's the one which is where you have a lack of governance, and you have perhaps a weak economy, and therefore it's very tempting for these states which have natural assets and resources, as we've seen for oil and gas, gold being the classic one in Sudan at the moment, I think, for Russian transactions. I think you've got to increasingly see these risk factors in a holistic manner. And I think part of that, I would also put natural capital and biodiversity loss in that as well. So the loss of the ability to produce one's own subsistence agriculture, the water resources, the impact of climate on this, and working back from it. So, I mean, you'll know the map of fragile states due to climate change going forwards. And I think that's perhaps slightly different from the petrostates, which take the oil and gas rents. So I suppose my only sort of comment on that is when you look at the risk registers for fragility in regions which may be open to sort of third-party exploitation / investment, I think quite often, and this is true of governments as well as, say, insurers and companies which look for political risk advice, it's done through quite a narrow lens, and it's not done over a different timescale looking at all those other factors. And I think when you do that, you get sort of what I think is called the black jellyfish swarm, where they're out there and they're going to all come together at one point, and everybody goes, "Oh my God, I didn't see that coming." But that's just because you didn't choose to watch it over time, I think. So there's no such thing as a black swan, but the black jellyfish are the sort of the smaller versions which all come together. And I think that's a long answer to saying I think the more integrated and holistically going forwards we can look at that under a climate lens, the better informed our political risk assessments are.
Yeah, Dan, go ahead, and then I'll pass over to the gentleman here.
So I'm Dan Marks. I'm the incoming research fellow in energy security at Root. I was wondering the extent to which you see a kind of a disconnect, or whether there has been a disconnect, whether that's changing with the current crisis, between energy policy and foreign policy. This is actually kind of the inverse of the question we just asked. In Europe and America, kind of the Western world, in their relations with fragile countries in their foreign policy. So effectively, I come from an Africa background, and the discussion there between the relationship between United Kingdom, Europe, and African governments tends to be a donor relationship. You have a lot of discussion of delegations from Europe coming over and saying you should be doing wind and solar. Perhaps you shouldn't be developing your hydrocarbons resources. All of this, you see very little kind of partnership based on trying to build government-to-government relationships, favorable kind of relationships that are favorable from an African perspective in terms of building local industry and things like that. And obviously, if you're talking about linking energy policy and foreign policy, you would expect kind of in places like Congo with minerals that you need from a future perspective, or your Tanzanias, your Mozambiques, your Angolas, places with massive LNG, massive gas potential, that there would be more discussion between Western governments and their governments about building their domestic industry as alternatives, as diverse sources. So I wonder, has there been a disconnect, or is there more work than we see, or do you see that changing?
I think the West is traditionally hypocritical in the sense that, and we're going back like 500 years here, right? In that sense, we want a sort of a nice, ethical, equitable world. And so we really need something really quickly. Then it's on whatever terms we're prepared to pay. And, the idea, there's a hierarchy of need, and it has the sort of the poorest subsistence people at the bottom, and it has the dictators with whom we are quite happy to deal at the top. So I think in times of stability and peace and abundance, there are great sort of foreign and development models in terms of, let's say, developing the renewable power of the Pan-African continent. Under pressure, it's investment in oil and gas, because, and the third element is, why do those nations, should they not be allowed to develop their oil and gas resources? And the idea that, you know, you see before Christmas, I think, big pressure on the government to say, let's, with the COP26, let's not allow funding of, or government support for any oil and gas licenses off Africa anymore. So that's what we're going to put as a statement for the UK. Today, 100 new licenses in the North Sea going ahead. So, you know, I'd say it's hypocritical, but basically it's necessity whenever time allows, I think. So Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland and chair of the elders, you know, she was vehemently against sort of, you know, Africa having oil and gas developments for carbon terms, thinking, you know, can this not be done along the terms that, you know, you suggested, and can we not have this as a model for renewable development? But, you know, some of her comments were taken slightly out of context, but in the sense of, well, you know, how will Africa make that development jump as a continent if it's not allowed to use gas exploitation? So I think the problem is one of different timeframes, and the idea of building a clean energy economy in some countries can happen, is happening, but taking Africa as a continent, I think the accessibility, quick access to hydrocarbon resources is on a different timescale, which the West particularly now wants. So, and that's where I think you would see, you still see a tension between the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and DFID as was. So that's, I think that probably gives you a sense of that there are two tracks at play here, and globally. So merging that department, I think it's had some interesting benefits, but tensions as well. So both can work, or both may not work at all. And good luck, by the way.
Yes. Just to the gentleman in the front, thank you.
My name is Peter Watkins. I was in the Ministry of Defence, and I wanted to ask a slightly narrower question about the scope and output of this project. I mean, just on the Ministry of Defence side of things, it published eventually a sustainability strategy in March 2021, almost immediately overtaken by other things, but there we are, it's out there. But I mean, both of you have said that, you know, this is urgent. But in terms of this project, I wondered, you know, what would you be looking to get out of it? Is it as an outlined strategy? Is it some myth busting? Is it building connections between the silos? Is it opening up the dialogue with our allies and partners? I mean, the NATO strategic concept says that NATO wants to be a thought leader in this area as well. I just wondered if, you know, both speakers might give us a sense of basically what Dan should be focusing on over the coming years.
It may be over the years. Go on,
Luca.
I'm the new boy here on this, on Rusi, not familiar as you are, but, you know, I think there are different levels, different angles to look at that. One is, you know, the defense sector itself, which is, okay, how do you decarbonize a sector? You know, because it is part of society, and it is part of the contribution to emission, and that is now a subset or a slice of the various sectors I mentioned before, from a transport, from material, from industry, from production, etc. Then there's a second element, which is okay, that's the national security, as I said before, in terms of dependence or interdependence from technology being developed, maintained, operated, or innovated abroad. You know, how resilient are we in not finding in a situation like most of Europe is finding itself now, which is depending from Russian gas. And despite all the big statement against Russia and in favor of Ukraine, is still importing or trying to import, and actually subject to Russia decision. So what if that was batteries in 20 years time, and that was China as opposed to Russia? You know, so how do we prevent that kind of thing? And this is more looking from inside out. And then there's the third angle, I would say, which is what we just alluded to, which is the political sphere of influences abroad, right? So there's the Belt and Road program of China trying to build alliances, especially in Africa and other parts of the world, with economic intervention. And what is the UK role, or what is the Western world role in that? You know, can we help Africa getting out of the energy situation in which at least 800 million people are without any access to energy whatsoever? at the same time leave the oil reserves in the ground. By doing so, are we setting an example? But how does the West world protect its own security, if you want, acting on the border, but acting on that geopolitical element? And what is that connection from energy transition on this free level, I would say?
Chris, any
I'll come at it a slightly different angle. Peter, you mentioned NATO. I mean, there's NATO Energy Security Centre of Excellence, and there's the new NATO Climate Security Centre in Ottawa, which is being stood up. I think one thing, and I'm sure we've all read reports and thought, what was the point of that? Or we've read a report and it's immediately out of date. And I think this is more about a process or a methodology. There are so many risk factors in this complex, wicked problem where you've got energy security, national security, and climate science, let's say, and trends. In that space, no one person or group can possibly have an understanding in real time of what is going on. So you do need this network of all the talents, but you need a common methodology or framework. And I think if an output was almost like a standing risk register into which a family of experts recognized in their field fed into and took responsibility for monitoring each of those risks, then that can act as an early warning system for government to say, look, you need to focus on that. You need to address this now. And I think, that's the one thing which I think feeding into National Security Secretariat, there's an energy security cell in there. There should be a climate security cell, a natural capital cell, or at least there should be a sense of how those interact. And I think the worst thing you can do is produce more and more massive reports constantly as the objective. I think if from that initial scoping year, let's say, with this project, we can then funnel it down to going, okay, these are the things we absolutely have to worry about. Focus on those and who is best to inform those. Then that is not a report. That is just a live resource which never goes out of date. And ultimately, you would spin out of that a quarterly one-pager for the National Security Advisor. It's kind of where I see it, because there's too much going on too quickly, and the rate of change is becoming exponential. That I think that's the only format in which I think we can probably process it for all people in this lexicon of risks.
You made me think of an analogy here, which is kind of a dashboard or a balance scorecard,
exactly.
which you have a partially conflicting interests. So a decision can have a positive impact on climate, but a negative impact on national security, and the impact on global stability. So it's that really interesting to develop a kind of a dashboard kind of indicators of how decision impact these three things at the same time.
I think that's a very creative note to end on, to be honest with you. Very inspiring note, as we're just hitting 4 o'clock, so the end of the online portion of the event. So thank you very much to everyone who's joined us online. Thank you to our speakers who have done an excellent job of giving us lots of food for thought, and thank you to all of the participants in person who have joined us and asked us very thought-provoking questions. I'm very sorry I couldn't get round to absolutely every question, and I do encourage you to get in touch with myself or any of the researchers at RUSI if you're interested in the project or engaging with us further. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.
Yes, there are lots of pastries, tea, coffee outside for everyone to enjoy.